he had a big ego, but people loved him. And I'll tell you what, he brought excitement to Wrigley Field. You just couldn't believe it. Excitement. You go to Wrigley. And,
I'd love to see Wrigley Field. But I bet in those days, huge stadium packed with enthusiastic fans and Sammy eating up the attention. How big were the crowds?
Guy was... All right, Henry, welcome back to America Talk It Up. We got another great show today, and I think what I wanted to talk about today, it was about the summer of 1998, where Sammy
Thrilling
Sosa.
summer.
It was a great summer.
Baseball needed that era. They needed that show. That year saved baseball. I don't know where you're going with it, but it was a classic year to save a sport that was dwindling in popularity.
Well, I was living in Hoffman Estates, a suburb of Chicago, 32 miles from downtown Chicago, about 22 miles from Wrigley Field. I had season tickets in 1998. I was in section 206, row 30, seat 4 through 8. That was my season tickets. And I was in with about 5 other guys. We all went in together and bought season tickets. And so I was there in 98. I went to about 20 baseball games at Wrigley. And then I actually went down to St. Louis with a bunch of guys, and we went to see a 3-game series between the Cubs and the Cardinals. So I got to watch McGuire and Sammy Sosa.
Wow.
And so I was there, you know, and I remember the excitement, but it was really a great summer. You know, there's a book by David Haverstein. He wrote a book called The Summer of 1949, and that was about the New York Yankees winning the pennant with Joe DiMaggio, Yogi Berra, and Casey Stengel. So that kind of the summer of '98 reminds me of the summer of 1949. If you get a chance, go to Amazon and buy the book. But this was great, and they had this thing on ESPN just the other day, and it was a great story. And here's my take of this whole thing. That spring, I went down there with a bunch of guys in my neighborhood. We went down to spring training from Illinois. We went to Arizona, and I went to a couple Cubs games and White Sox games. And I was sitting there with my friend, and I was looking at Sammy Sosa, and I said, you know what? It looks like he's bulked up. He looks bigger than he was. Now, just so you know, up until 1998, Sammy had 36 home runs in 95. 96, he hit 40. He hit 36 in 97. So it didn't, I mean, for him to go from 36 to 66, that's quite a jump. And I remember up until 98, he had a lot of long fly balls that didn't go out of the ballpark, or he would hit the ball to right field, just never quite made it. So all of a sudden, that spring, he looked kind of bulked up. Now, I didn't know he was taking performance drugs. At that time, nobody was talking about it. And by the way, in defense of Mark McGuire and Sammy Sosa and all those other guys, there was no league rules that you could take performance drugs. There was no any rules. There was no regulation you couldn't. So I think Major League Baseball, after those seasons, they finally figured out something was different. But anyway, so I saw that. So he comes out in 98, and I went to the second game, and all of a sudden the ball was popping out of Wrigley. He was hitting home runs out of right field. He hit some home runs out to Shetland Boulevard, I mean, he looked like something that was a different Sammy Sosa. And that's when all this started. And then Mark McGuire, everybody thought Mark McGuire was going to be the guy, because the year before he hit 58 home runs. Everybody thought he was going to be the guy to hit 61 to beat Roger Maris. Not Sammy Sosa. Sammy was, I don't think he was on the radar. But all of a sudden, Mark McGuire, he gets off in a really great start. He's taken off, and Sammy just doesn't hit home runs in cold weather. He wasn't a cold weather guy. You know how the weather in Wrigley in April and May, it gets pretty chilly, especially if the wind blowing in. So anyway, that's what set this thing all up. And what really shocked everybody is in the month of June, Sammy hit 20 home runs, the most ever in the month of June. He still holds the record, 20. And all of a sudden, he's in the race. And then every day from July all the way to the last day of the season, it was a battle between both of those guys, back and forth. And it was just a great race.
Writers say despite speculation that these guys were juiced up, it was still the most exciting baseball they had ever experienced. Drama to the maximum.
The only difference is the Cubs made it to the playoffs, the Cardinals didn't. But Mark McGuire, I mean, and people knew he was taking supplements, but nobody was talking about, I never thought much of it because in 1987, I was in the Bay Area, and that was his rookie year. He hit 49 home runs. And I remember going out to Oakland and watched him play. I used to take Bart out there. They had $7 bleacher seats. You can go out there for $1 beer. So it was really cheap to go to an Oakland A's game. And I remember Canseco, the Bash brothers, they were a team. And so I didn't think of much about the juicing up, but it was kind of, Sammy went from one dimension to another dimension size-wise. So this is what happened to Barry Bonds. Even though I think Barry Bonds would have gone into the Hall of Fame without juicing, he didn't need to do it. Because he already had a Hall of Fame career by the time he started taking the performance drugs.
Same thing for McGuire.
Yeah, he didn't need to do it. But with that saying, Sammy really, I think, got the benefit because remember, he had 66 home runs in 98. He hit 62 in 99. In 2001, he hit 64. 2000, he hit 50. He's the only guy in Major League history that ever hit 60 homers 3 times. Nobody's ever done it. I think Mark McGuire did it twice, but I'm looking at his scale. He did it twice, but he hit 70 and then he hit 65. I think it was 65. But with that saying, Sammy just went from nowhere to somebody, and the ball was flying out, and we didn't think much. It was just excitement. You go to a game of Wrigley, and there's Sammy knocking the ball out of the ballpark. So it was a pretty exciting summer.
And Sammy had that special personality. He was always accessible, always smiling, blowing kisses to his mom in the Dominican Republic or Puerto Rico. And he was exciting from the standpoint of he had the whole package. He was base hitting, he was hitting the long ball, and it'd give you that personality. A very popular sports figure. That
year, he hit 66 home runs, 158 RBIs. He batted .308. And up until that year, his best batting average was .273, and then he had 73 walks. But the year that he had a great year was 2001. He had 64 home runs, 160 RBIs. He batted .328. That was probably his best year, even though he didn't hit 66. But it was a great year. Sammy, the thing that I love about Sammy, there's over 1.2 million Hispanic people live in Chicago, and he was really the first great star for the Hispanic population of Chicago, the Midwest. They just love him. I would go to Mexican restaurants there. Of course, the Mexican food in Chicago is nothing like our food. We have all this green chili. It's more like Mexico food, but God, you would go, the excitement in the Hispanic communities in Chicago, especially on the west side. Sammy owned the town. He was the only person that might be bigger than he was Michael Jordan, and he was there at the same time. They were sharing the town. Both of them shared the town, the limelight. But he had a big ego, but people loved him. And I'll tell you what, he brought excitement to Wrigley Field. You just couldn't believe it. Excitement. You go to Wrigley. And,
I'd love to see Wrigley Field, but I bet in those days, huge stadium packed with enthusiastic fans and Sammy eating up the attention. How big were the crowds?
Guy was sold out every time. I got there in '94, and I would go buy single tickets, but it was just so hard to buy single tickets because there weren't that many. So I went to a bunch of guys in my office. There was about 4 or 5 of us who loved the Cubs. We had a couple of guys that loved the White Sox, and we just all got together. I think we invested about $500 per guy. We bought 4 season tickets. We had a parking pass. That was another thing. If you didn't have a parking pass, it was hard to park around there. So we parked. We had a parking lot about 2 blocks from the stadium, and it was great. I just enjoyed going to Wrigley. For my house, I lived out in the western suburbs. It took me about, I would say 35 to 40 minutes to get there to Wrigley. And when I parked my car, I was in the stadium in 10 minutes. But there's nothing. It's all the restaurants and the neighborhood around Wrigley. That's what makes Wrigley. Because you could go eat there. And there was a guy from Belen, New Mexico named Bobby Chavez. And his wife was Helen Martinez. And they got married. And he got a job running a restaurant in Chicago. He wanted to open up his own pizzeria. So he opened up a pizza place 2 blocks from Wrigley called Yahtzee's. You know, like the game Yahtzee? And he was the only one I ever saw in Chicago that put green chili on the pizza. And I would go there, and the place was packed. He had an upstairs, downstairs, outdoor patio. And he was the only New Mexican I knew that owned a restaurant, but it wasn't now he used to own a Mexican, but he decided to make people love pizza in Chicago. So he made it more New Mexico style. He had green chili pizza, and I would go there about an hour before the game and see the guy. And I was one of the few New Mexicans that even paid, because there wasn't that many people from New Mexico was going to Wrigley, but this couple came up there and they made a nice living there. As far as I know, maybe I ought to look it up. I think Yahtzee's is still around. I think the pizza place is still there. I don't know if they still own it, but it was a great place to go. And so that summer was unbelievable. But Mark McGuire, he talked to the press, but Sammy would talk to everybody. And Sammy won that town over. The Hispanic population, they didn't have a real hero. The African Americans loved Ernie Banks and Billy Williams, but there has been some great Hispanic players, but for some, Sammy had that charisma. You're right. He was fun to watch, Henry.
Yeah.
And, I hope they welcome him back. Right now, people are still upset they took Juicy. But you know what, Henry? If Mickey Mantle, all those guys in the 50s and 40s, if they had a chance to make themselves better, you think they would have taken some drugs? I think they probably would have. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, even pitchers around in Sammy's era, pitchers were known to be taking enhancing drugs. And like you say, the stress factor of recovery from injury and how to maintain that level of strength every day. 165 games is a long time.
And your body just doesn't recover. And you've heard about the dog days of summer where a guy, I remember there was guys who had 37 home runs at the All-Star break, and then all of a sudden they just go off because their body just falls apart.
Yeah.
And so I think the performance drugs enhance. So we're going to end this segment. We'll come back and talk more about this because I still got some more stories about the summer of '98.
Yeah. Well, you picked a great subject. That's an exciting time.
Yes. So, Henry, getting back to this about the summer of '98, here's the thing you have to understand. Back when Roger Maris hit 61 and Babe Ruth, they didn't see high-power relief pitchers coming in at the 7th or 8th or 9th inning.
Good point.
Most starters went 9 innings, and then they figured out the pitcher. You notice they got a lot of home runs in the 7th and 8th inning because they figured out the pitchers. So Roger Maris had that. Of course, Roger was healthy, and he had Mickey Mantle pushing, and then Mickey breaks down the last 2 weeks of the season, 1961. And then you look at Reggie Jackson. Reggie Jackson had some years where he had 37 at the All-Star break, but his body just didn't respond. They said the dog days of summer, their body doesn't respond. You said 164 games. I mean, your body and then what happens is they tail off in late August and September, and so they never quite get to 60 home runs. That was a tough thing what Roger did, but I think it was harder to do it in that era because of the relief pitchers came in. They saw 100 miles an hour pitchers, different guys. So what the
That is a great point.
Yeah.
Because, man, you got flamethrowers today.
and you're seeing different pitchers. And then here's the thing, is the performance drugs rejuvenated their bodies. Because if you think about it, on Friday night, on September, the last weekend of the season in 1998, Sammy Sosa and Mark McGuire was tied at 66 home runs on Friday night. So McGuire had 65 and Sammy had 65. Sammy hits a home run in the third inning at another game, and this was Friday night, and both of them hit home runs. Okay? So they were tied going into Saturday and Sunday, the last two games, at 66. And as you know, McGuire was the one that broke 61 first. That's why he got all that notoriety. So you got to understand, your body's tired, right? Sammy goes 1 for 4, I think 1 for 3 on Saturday and Sunday, and he didn't get a home run. But Mark McGuire hit 2 home runs on Saturday, so he's at 68. And then going into Sunday, he tells the manager, Tony La Russa, I don't think I want to play. And La Russa said, you got to go out because the fans paid money to watch you. So he hits 2 more home runs on Sunday, and he ends up with 70 home runs in 1968. Now, I don't think with performance drugs, I don't know if the body could have responded. And that's why even though at that time we didn't know a lot about performance drugs, people was just into the excitement. But if those records, they are tainted a little bit because the other guys didn't have that advantage, in my opinion.
Wow. See how good it was for baseball? It
was great for baseball.
The fan up in the corner of the stadium didn't know anything about enhancing drugs. He just came to see the guy that was going to hit 70 for the season. And the same with Sosa's crowd. They arrived to watch him. Didn't care an inch anything about what a drug was. They just loved their baseball. He kept knocking the ball out of the park, both of them. And they come into those dramatic closing weeks, the closing games. Wow. And even the commissioner, he probably knew what was going on, but he knew it was saving baseball.
And they had the strike in 94, and that really, people turned off people in 94. So this was the thing that brought baseball back. I remember on August 16th, it was my birthday, August 16th, a bunch of us went to, the Cubs were playing the Cardinals in Wrigley. It was one of those series between the Cardinals and the Cubs. And I remember getting to the ballpark at least 2.5 hours before the game. And out there on Shetland Boulevard, thousands, because they were there for the batting practice. McGuire would get to the batting practice, and he hit balls out to Shetland Avenue, and people went crazy. There was like 3,000 or 4,000 people in the streets. It was like a street fair. And then when McGuire got done, then Sammy came in the box and did the same thing. And I've never, to this day, it was... if you were there, it was unbelievable. You just sat there, the ball was launching out to the street. You know how Wrigley's built; it's right there on a street. Mm-hmm. And so all those balls of Shetland Boulevard. So anyway, that was a magic moment that I got to witness. Both of them doing batting practices. It was like they was putting on a show, and that's what brought baseball back. And and nobody, and just so everybody knows, at that time, nobody was talking about performance drugs. It was not on any conversation. There was somebody mentioned late August that McGuire was taking some substance or something, powder. Somebody mentioned it, but it wasn't illegal at the time. Nothing was illegal. So what they were doing, and you got to think about it, Henry. A lot of those players, they were finding out this guy was doing it, hitting more home runs. So it was like a vicious cycle. Everybody had to get into the game. It
was socially accepted.
And
what can you do?
And if you're going to keep a contract, they're paying you to hit home runs. They're paying you. And so you were in a really vulnerable situation. You took it. And I understand Sammy, and believe me, Sammy looked different from 97 to 98. And when I saw him at spring training, you had to see his body. All of a sudden, his body was bulked up, and all of a sudden, the ball was popping out of the stadium.
But, even though the drugs enhance your strength, and
recovery
you got the
time.
extra power and the recovery time too. Still, the athleticism, the hand and eye coordination, eyes see ball, fastball, arms extended. How do you see and hit at the same time a ball that's moving that fast? You know, people, even the writers who sit up there in their little corner and they're in charge of their little element or their corner of the world, have never been at the plate to see a 100-mile-per-hour fastball. That alone is fascinating. Drugs or no drugs, first of all, you got to see it and hit it. That's a challenge. Other guys on the team weren't hitting the ball as regularly, but, you know, certainly weren't hitting it as far. But it still takes that see it, hit it skill.
Well, yeah, and you know, here's the thing is, Henry, you still have to have great hand and eye coordination in baseball. So first you got to have that going for you. Now the difference is, in 1961, Mickey Mantle was at 56 home runs and his body breaks down. He's fighting with Roger Maris, like the summer of 98, the summer of 61. Mantle's body just broke down. He couldn't play the last week or so. Now, if he would have had performance drug, he might have been able to make it through the season. Who knows what the record would have been? That's what's amazing what Roger Maris did, and give Roger Maris a lot of credit. People don't give him enough credit for what he did in that season. And
everybody liked Mick.
Everybody loved Mick. And
everybody looking for number 7
to win.
Number 9 was irrelevant. You know, he was good, he was respected, but he didn't have the personality that Mick had. Maris was very humble, very quiet. In New York City, a quiet athlete, later. Respected, but not loved, like Mantle was.
So in that movie at 61, there's a scene in the movie, Mickey breaks down, he's in the hospital. And Roger Maris goes in the hospital knowing that Mickey's not going to finish the season. Mickey's stuck at 56. Mm-hmm. And now, the reason why I know a lot about that scene is I told you in a previous episode I met Moose Gowan in Schaumburg, Illinois. And Moose was the one who told me that Mickey was the greatest teammate he ever had. You know, we brought that up in one of our episodes.
Yeah.
But I remember what Moose said to me when Maris went up there. Mickey started crying. He said, "You do it for me. Roger, do it for me. You gotta break this record. I'm sick of Babe Ruth record." He said, "You got to do it for us." And you know, so they were good friends. Just that Roger was a low key guy, Mickey was the leader, and that the whole team pulled for Roger. And if you watch that movie, I still think it's a great movie. 61.
I love that movie.
That was really the scene. That was the scene back in those days. And I asked Moose about that, and Moose said that really did happen. And Mickey was pulling for him all the way. And you know, funny thing is, when Roger Maris died, he died of cancer, and Roger's from Fargo. Mickey was still good friends with Roger's wife. He and Yogi Berra and all those guys decided to have a charity cancer golf tournament in Fargo, North Dakota. And the first year they raised $500,000. They went out there to Fargo. They had a golf tournament in Fargo for Roger Maris. And to this day, I think the tournament still is a charity tournament. But Mickey started it. That's how much they love Roger Maris.
Yeah. Well, it was an interesting story. You know, I was a little kid when all that was going on, but you can really appreciate the fans of Yankee fans. They're the best in the world, the loudest, most flamboyant. And Yankee Stadium, which I've never seen a game in there, that's on my bucket list. I would love to feel that true Yankee environment someday. And, you know, they weren't real nice to Maris. Maris was trying as hard as he could. And how much the media and the fans were pulling for Mickey to win that batting title or to break the record of 61. It was really a tough time for Maris with his shy personality to deal with all that.
But he did redeem himself. He played his last 2 years with St. Louis, and they won the World Series in '68.
Yeah.
And Augie Bush loved him so much, he gave him a Budweiser distributorship in St. Petersburg, Florida. And with that, when Mark McGuire broke the record in '98, the Maris family was there. The first thing he did, he runs up and gives him a hug. Roger's wife was still alive, and the 2 kids, the Maris brothers, boys. And that was a class act by Mark McGuire, but he did redeem. There's one thing you can say: the St. Louis fans, they do love baseball. If you ever go to St. Louis, it's a great baseball town. Probably, I would say their fans are probably greater than the Cubs, but the Cubs have great fans. But St. Louis, they love baseball. It's still one of the great baseball towns, just like the Yankee Stadium.
And I've been to Busch Stadium. Wow, what a classic place. Classic place.
So, folks, we're going to wrap up.
Both those stories are so compelling, and maybe a little different here and there, but still the great drama was at both places.
So we're going to get in this segment. We'll come back. We've got more to talk about, another Marty Watts story. But, hey, that was a great summer of '98.
Thank you, Marty.
Hi, everybody. We're back to our last segment. Hey, you know what, Henry? I am proud that I am a New Mexican.
Amen. I'll double that.
What I love about our state is the Native Americans we have in our state, our history with our rich history of Native Americans, our history with the Hispanic population here. And by the way, if people don't know that, New Mexico is the only place left in the United States where we have our own Spanish culture, own architecture. Actually, we have our own Hispanic Culture Center, nothing like it in the United States. And outside of Mexico City, the University of New Mexico Library has the largest volume of Spanish writing. Did you know that?
I had no idea.
You could go to our library at the University of Mexico outside of Mexico City. So we have a rich tradition. And then the the United States took over New Mexico in 1846, August 15th. And I don't know if he was a relative of mine. His name was Stephen Watts Kearny. He was a general in Kansas. And supposedly his mother is a Watts. And as far as I know, they came from Virginia. My family came from Virginia. But he had about 1,700 soldiers, and that's when the Mexican-American War started in late 1845, but it was June of 1846, so he gets the order to go and capture New Mexico.
Wow.
Now, at that time, the guy who was the governor of Santa Fe, his name was Aramijo, and he was a famous governor, and you've heard of the Aramijo family. They're famous in the state, right? They've been here for 300 years. And just so you know, Henry's family, the DeFoyas, been here for 392 years. You're one of the oldest families in all of the United States. Didn't you know that?
I had no clue.
So what happened was...
Only you, out of all our New Mexicans, know these facts. Because you're the storyteller. You're the researcher. Things cling to you. You got that photographic memory that we all admire. So I believe you.
So let's set up the scenario, August 1846. Now, 15 years earlier, Mexico has a revolt and secedes from Spain. They had their own country. Mexico broke away from Spain, I think 10 or 15 years before, 1846. So at that time, New Mexico was being governed by Mexico City, Henry, and it was very loosely run because Mexico City, they didn't have much communication. I think it would take you weeks to get from Mexico City to Santa Fe. So it was a very loosely organized government in New Mexico in August 1846. So here was the problem, is that Aramijo had about 3,000 soldiers. I think he had a couple hundred cannons. He could have, if he would have defended Santa Fe, he would have probably won the battle. But what changed the whole story was when Stephen Watts Kearny came down from Colorado Springs, got through the Raton Pass, the Native American tribes started joining his force. Some of them were upset because, you know, when a conqueror takes over an area like the Spanish did, they still have some old resentments. You know, and that's probably why that statue on Nate, the Native Americans don't think great of it on Nate. But remember this, Henry, when you conquer a new territory, it's never an easy thing. The history goes to the victors. Am I right?
Amen.
Pretty much. So anyway, they were coming down, and the word gets back to Don Mijo in Santa Fe that, hey, the Indians are joining Stephen Watts Kearny, the American Army. And the Army had about 1,700 soldiers, but the Army in Santa Fe was way over 3,000. They had more men, they had more gunpowder. So anyway, he decides that maybe we take a stand. So they were going to set up an ambush in Apache Canyon. Now, Apache Canyon is 10 miles south of Santa Fe, and if you know anything about New Mexico, they were going to ambush the American Army and the Native Americans and beat them right there. Well, here's what happened. There was a guy named James McKitchen, and I don't know if I got his name right. He was a American person who lived in Santa Fe. He was a wealthy trader. He goes and tries to tell Aramijo, you don't have a chance of winning this battle. And he actually, the story goes back that he bribed the guy. He bribed Aramijo. Hey, why don't you just give it up? Well, anyway, they were ready about an hour before the Americans showed up in Apache Canyon. Manuel Chavez was the head of the army for the Mexican army. He decides, well, let's just go back to Santa Fe. When they got back to Santa Fe, Aramijo decides, well, we're just going to leave. And he took the whole army, and they went to El Paso. He left Santa Fe. So Stephen Watts Kearny walks into Santa Fe without shooting one shot. One shot. That's how New Mexico was taken over by the United States. Now,
it's amazing the detail that you know.
Well, here's the thing. And so anyway, they took over, and the first governor was Charles Bent. He was the first territorial governor. But in January of 1846, I think it was 46, there was a revolt. The Pueblo Indians up in Taos and the Pueblo tribe got together with the Spanish landowners to say, look, maybe we should fight the Americans. They didn't like the way things were going, you know. The Americans just took over the territory. So there was a revolt in Arroyo Hondo. If you know where Taos is, there's a thing called Arroyo Hondo. Have you heard of that, Henry?
Vaguely.
So they called it the Taos Revolt. They had about 1,200 Pueblo Indians in Mexican army, or mostly citizens, Mexican citizens or Spanish citizens, and they fought the Americans. The Americans had about 500, and they had a revolt, and it was, I think 15 Americans got killed, maybe 100, but they captured them, 400 at a church there in Taos, and that was the end of the revolt. And there was a minor skirmish in Mora and Las Vegas, and that was the only revolt there was in the American territory, and that's how New Mexico became part of the United States. But anyway, that's how it all happened, and of course a lot of people don't know that story, but I always said, what if Aramijo would have fought? He had more soldiers, he had more weapons, but somehow he decided not to defend Santa Fe. And I always wonder if that would have changed American history, if the Spanish people would have fought.
Well, as you look back on all the research, and you told me early in our conversation how much you appreciate being from New Mexico, when you read all of that history, and obviously I'd encourage you to love your state, to really know it that well, do you advise our viewers to do the same? Where can they find out more information about this beautiful state and its history, as you just conveyed? What
happened? But so when America took over, there was some good and bad. The bad was the Spanish. You know, you heard about the Spanish land grants. A lot of the Spanish people, they had land grants. They didn't understand the new American laws and taxes, and some of that land was taken away from them, and unjustly, I think. And then when the cattle barons came in from back east, you heard of Harding County, Catron County, Maxwell. They were cattle barons, and they took over. And that was back when the Lincoln Wars cattle wars with Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid. So New Mexico's had a lot of change, but we're the only state that's kept our culture, Hispanic culture. We do have a rich history, and think about it, Henry. 55% of all our elected officials in this state is Hispanic surname.
Now, as we close out
Yes.
today, how can we all
Come together.
get a little bit better, how do you say, education? How do we learn what you know?
Well, if you know your history, but you know what, we
What
have
if we
to.
don't know?
But we got to come together as
How
a
do
culture.
we do that?
Well, I don't know if
What library did you go to?
well,
Did you go to the museum?
I took a lot of classes at the University of New Mexico in history. I did go up in Santa Fe and study the history at the Palace of the Governors. And then another thing I've done, Henry, is I've talked to all the old Hispanic families in this town. I even got to know Reyes Lopez Tiarina, the famous Reyes, the one that led the revolt on the land grants up in Rio Arriba County. Actually, he was a paper I did at the New Mexico Highlands University. So I tried to walk in their shoes. And I understand why there was upset about the land grant, because some of that land was taken away, and they didn't have lawyers to defend them. But we have a rich history. But the thing is, we're probably the only state that really has this rich Hispanic culture, and it's a blended. I call it the Rainbow Coalition. The Native Americans, so they have their issues, their history. Some of their history wasn't great when the takeover was. But so there's a lot of things about our state. But thing is, we have to love each other. We have to come together, Henry.
Well, that's a great commentary. But just give me a hint of where I can get some of that education.
Well, there's a book. I'm trying to think. There. I'm going blank. There's a book written by. I'll just have to come up with the next segment. But there's a book that came out at the University of New Mexico that explains the history of the Native Americans in the Rio Grande Valley. And if you understand New Mexico, you got to understand the Pueblo Indians and the people that lived in the Rio Grande Valley before the Spanish ever came here. You have to understand their history, because they play a big part before the Spanish and the Americans ever showed up.
All right. Hey, we're out of time.
We're out of time, so.
Way to go.
Let's go, and I just hope this segment helps you understand what happened here in New Mexico back in August of 1840.
You continue to amaze me.
Yeah, August of 1846.
Wow.
Things changed in New
He's
Mexico.
an amazing guy, and you see him every Wednesday right here. Thank you, Marty.
All right. What do we say, Asha Baba?
Ole.
Ole.